Really quickly, we'll go through a few abbreviations that we're going to use pretty frequently. BECx or BECx, Building Enclosure Commissioning. NIBS, the National Institute of Building Science. LEED, I think most people are familiar. ASTM, formerly the American Society for Testing of Materials, now just ASTM International. ASHRAE, also abandoning its former acronym and moving towards kind of a new identity as ASHRAE. And BECxP, or the Building Enclosure Commissioning Provider, it's a term defined in ASTM, and we're going to use that a lot. It's the person in responsible charge of enclosure commissioning. Learning objectives, we're going to introduce the concept of building enclosure commissioning briefly. There's a second module that discusses the process in depth per the standard 2813, ASTM E 2813. We're going to introduce some relevant industry standards for BECx. We're going to discuss a little bit about ASHRAE, which is obviously overall commissioning industry standards. Review the history of standards development, how we got to where we are today. Talk a little bit about where we're going. Understand the minimum requirements established in the standards presented, and understand some required qualifications for the provider and or their teams. We're going to focus on the standards and guidelines listed here. So we're going to look at ASHRAE 202, ASTM E 2813, and I was just republished, so it's actually 18 now. ASTM E 2947, which is its companion guide. So 2813 is the standard practice for building enclosure commissioning. 2947 is a guide that goes along with it, is a companion to it. NIBS Guideline 3, which was last updated in 2012 and is no longer being updated. The International Green Construction Code, which talks about commissioning and then also building enclosure commissioning. And LEED version 4, which talks about both commissioning and building enclosure commissioning. Quickly, we talked about both standards and guidelines. So there is a difference between the two. Standards are enforceable. They're written in mandatory language. You shall do this, you shall do that. Guidelines provide best practices or explanatory language. So when we're talking about the building enclosure commissioning standards for ASTM, anything that's mandatory lives in the standard, 2813. Guidance should be in the guide, 2947. Standards, as a result, are more easily adopted by code, and they can be used more easily in the US legal system. I don't want to say that the guides are never used in that way, because I think that's probably not true, but they're more readily adopted in those circles because they establish mandatory requirements. Guidelines are, we're talking about non-mandatory language, best practice. I think they tend to have a little bit more flexibility to develop or to discuss a wider variety of things because they're not mandatory. So if you want to talk about a special case, you're not suddenly making some elements of that special case mandatory. They have the flexibility to provide exemplars. Of course, mandatory documents often contain non-mandatory things like appendices that can have this information as well, or footnotes, depending on how the mandatory document is structured. But a guideline is a more robust version of this. I'll say as well, from the perspective of developing a consensus standard, and I actually should have taken a moment to introduce myself a little bit further. So I'll take a pause. The reason that I understand anything about developing a consensus standard is that I am the task group chair for the committee, the ASTM committee that houses the commissioning standards. So 2947 and 2813. So if afterwards you'd like to share with me any suggestions, thoughts, or complaints you have about those standards, I'm all ears. Those are living documents that continue to be edited and amended to make them better, keep them updated, etc. So I have some experience working in consensus standards, and it is my experience that there's more flexibility in terms of members for a guide because it is non-mandatory and for the content that can be in there versus a standard. I think there is a much more rigid approach between the folks who are being asked to come to a consensus. So we talked about the provider as one of the main people, well, the main person, the person in responsible charge of commissioning. 2813 defines this role specifically, and obviously this person may be part of a larger total commissioning team, But for enclosure commissioning, this person is where the rubber meets the road. They're the one who has to answer for any problems and is responsible for seeing commissioning through from beginning to end. How many folks are familiar with this role, have been in this role, have never worked on a project with enclosure commissioning before, don't even know what I'm talking about?
Question I would have is, when you're in government work and looking at the specifications, Division 1 defines the requirement for the commission, instead of Division 7, which identifies the testings and the qualifications to perform those tests. Two separate things.
Yeah, so are you talking about like if you're using a United Facilities guide spec or?
Yes.
Yeah, so Division 1 does have a commissioning discussion, it's optional. You can choose, you can elect to include enclosure commissioning. I've had the experience where actually the federal government will allow you to expand that. So that is sort of viewed as the minimum. It's very minimum. It's actually, I think, 2 site visits and a whole building air test. And that's it. And that's called commissioning. So I think I would disagree that that should really be termed commissioning. I've had the experience that we can move to incorporate testing, performance testing that's specified in section 7 and 8. So they may have curtain wall testing and things like that, and include that as part of our test plan and the commissioning plan and expand that role. But it's you have to do that on a project by project basis. You're not guaranteed in the specs to get that role. Is that? That's a great point though. I think this is true for all commissioning. My specialty is enclosure commissioning. There's a lot of things out there that people want to call commissioning. Where this course is focused on looking at the particular relevant standards that I've listed, and specifically using ASTM E2813 as a guide for sort of the minimum process. Below which, if you're commissioning below that, I think this course is saying that that's not really what we're addressing. I would say that's maybe not really commissioning, might be controversial, but. All right. And one more note on the government, the roles get very, I mean, the government has like 10 million commissioning people. There's the CXC and the CXA and all this. So that is much more complex. I still feel like there should be someone in responsible charge. And so identifying who that is in each team is really key. But yeah. All right. So, do you want to do it for us? Oh, I guess we're never gonna know. We're never gonna know. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, no. All right. So 60% were B. I saw that. So we have quite a few people who have worked on a project that includes BECx, but not in the provider role. A couple who had never worked on a BECx project, and a couple who are new to this discussion. It seemed like, based on the flash of numbers I just saw. There we go. So what is building enclosure commissioning? It's an additive process. It's not the process by which the general contractor and architect abdicate responsibility for designing or constructing the building. It is, in some ways, owners will ask, haven't I already paid for this? Right? This is an additive quality assurance process that is intended to establish project requirements, evaluate those project requirements for inclusion in the design and for construction during the building's construction. So we're evaluating that through design, construction, and even post-occupancy to see that the owner got what they said they wanted at the beginning of the job. And owners have asked me, aren't I already paying for this? Doesn't the contractor owe me what I wanted? Doesn't the architect owe me this? And to some extent, the answer is yes, right? Regardless of commissioning, the architect and contractor have duties to the owner, whether or not they hire someone like me to come onto the project. However, and certainly my role is not to allow them to abdicate from their responsibility. However, I think anyone who's involved in any commissioning can see that for certain projects, there's value in an added quality assurance project. Mission critical projects, complex projects. So this is the definition that 2813 lays out. It's a little bit more wordy than what I just said, but it basically says the same thing. Building enclosure commissioning is a process that begins with the establishment of the owner's project requirements, write down all the requirements, and endeavors to ensure that the exterior enclosure and those elements intended to provide environmental separation within a building or structure meet or exceed the expectations of the owner as defined in the OPR. And the document goes on to talk about doing that through design, construction, and post-occupancy or occupancy phases. Why do it? Why bring someone on? Why have this additive process? Uncontrolled rainwater penetration and condensation are two of the most common threats to building enclosure performance. 90% of all water intrusion problems occur within 1% of the total building area, so that's the interfaces. And I am certain I've seen on a lot of drawings that those interfaces are just by others. So they're not by any particular subcontractor, right? The window guy, he has his window, and how it connects to the wall is by others. There's flashings that he's drawn in, those are by others. They may not be purchased on the job. And so having someone who's looking at that process through design and construction can be a good preventative tool. It's not, there we go. These statistics are kind of order of magnitude. They're a little bit hard to continually tease out year after year, but uncontrolled rainwater penetration and condensation, so water issues in buildings, represent a very large portion of construction-related claims. There's a lot of money related to these problems. The built environment also accounts for about 40% of energy use, or at least a very large slice of the pie, anytime you ever look at an energy use pie chart for the US. And there's estimates that 60 to 70% of the materials extracted, processed, and consumed are related to building, or are going into our buildings. I apologize. Okay. Having a little trouble advancing the slides. So, failure in the project delivery process can be very expensive. Actually, the water on the floor picture, that's an office building in Washington, D.C. There was a flashing detail that was missed. Essentially, it was missed in design. It didn't get detailed in construction. And as they were getting ready to begin to lease space and start build outs, they found that they were having significant rainwater penetration, as you can see. The fix was about $4 million to go back. That is just construction costs. That does not even look at liquidated damages, because they did not start leasing those spaces when they expected to. A peer review or a design review of those details, I think, would have revealed this issue very quickly, and it would have avoided $4 million in cost. They would have gotten their building open at least a lot closer to on schedule. So there is good preventative reason to think about enclosure commissioning. Again, I think a lot of owners will ask, well, again, I bought this, right? Like, why don't I just have this? Why didn't I have to do this 15 years ago? Why do I have to do it now? There's a bunch of different theories out there that I've heard. There is a significant compartmentalization of the design profession, and any profession. I think specializing and then trying to avoid siloing is probably a common issue across every profession at the moment right now, is having that discussion. So architects may or may not be well versed in specifics of enclosure design, or they may have compartmentalized that off to a different department. There is a rising incidence and cost of litigation, so there's just more money behind these issues. More people are going through with claims, more people are making it expensive to make these problems. There's a suggestion that there's just declining skill levels in the construction trades. I'm always a little bit hesitant about that one. I think it's very true that we have an introduction of increasingly more complex systems, and we have higher demands on our buildings. We have higher expectations for thermal comfort, what our buildings are going to be able to do in terms of energy performance, and what they're going to deliver for us, being inside of them, how we're going to feel inside of them. All of those things combined, I think, can create a failure to deliver. or can create challenges to deliver. The actual cost of building enclosure commissioning is less than 1% of total construction cost. It's very, very, very small. It's a lot less than $4 million. You're talking maybe on a big job, a couple $100,000. On a very big job. So there's some good reasons why you might want to select enclosure commissioning, particularly for a mission critical job. How do we get from a place where we didn't have this practice area, we didn't have enclosure commissioning, to a place where now we're talking about educational programs and certificates and certifications for it? In the 1980s, ASHRAE formed the initial commissioning committee and developed several documents, Guideline 1 and 1.1. Ultimately, in 2000, ASHRAE joined forces with NIBS, who is putting on this today, to develop a universal CX process, and that's Guideline 0. Guideline 0 is the process document. Later, in 2006, NIBS actually developed Guideline 3, which is for enclosure CX. So if you look quickly up here, Guideline 0 would be the process document for new buildings, and then guidelines with numbers next to them are specific to disciplines, with Guideline 3 being building enclosure. ASHRAE continues to revise their documents, develop additional documents. In 2012, NIBS and ASTM come to a memorandum of agreement. That's how ASTM starts to get involved now. We had NIBS and ASHRAE working on this. Now ASTM enters the scene. The memorandum of agreement was intended to allow for the development of the ASTM standards. So NIBS Guideline 3 is updated for the last time in 2012, and the standard E2813, Standard Practice for Building Enclosure Commissioning, is published that same year. In June 2013, Standard 202 is approved, and Standard 202 is referenced significantly in 2813. That process is consistent across the two documents. So the Memorandum of Agreement was intended to support the development of standards, guidelines, certifications, and education and training materials related to building enclosure and design, construction, and commissioning. The intent when the standards first started their sort of migration effort was to take the technical depth relating Guideline 3 and create a standard, a minimum level of commissioning that was enforceable. So no guideline language, no you should, you shall, best practices, examples, but a minimum standard. That was E2813. And later, 2947 was developed, and it's a little bit more of the direct descendant of Guideline 3 because it's also a guide document. And in fact, several of the tables and charts are either already migrated over from Guideline 3 or we're in the process of continuing to migrate them over. So the companion guide is published in 2014. There was a recent revision to 2813. A couple of highlights from that. We've had some terminology changes. This is actually something I get a lot of comments about as the technical contact. There's a lot of confusion about the terminology. So we moved from the description of a team to a group in the standard. There's some updates to the OPR annex, which talks about OPR development to align with code changes. And then there's been some edits to the testing in Annex A. That continues to be a work in progress. For any of you who are familiar with the standard, Annex A testing is probably the biggest point of confusion in the industry. How it should be applied, what are the minimum standards for enhanced and fundamental, and there's no real need for, it really should be much more clear. So that continues to be a work in progress, and we're working through the process of editing that while maintaining all of the appropriate technical content and making sure that any previous footnotes get appropriately reincorporated and everyone is happy and moving it through the consensus process. We also added some discussions in the core competencies to talk about principles for structural loading and structural capacity of materials. So, enclosure commissioning providers should probably understand how, say, wind is going to affect their enclosure and any other potential forces acting on the enclosure. So the memorandum of agreement is also why I'm here today. We talk about training and education and certification, and the memorandum of agreement was really the birth of all of these efforts. So we're kind of continuing that through today. All right. We'll begin our discussion of the documents with Standard 202, which is the foundation of the process, and then we'll talk more about LEED 2813, 2947, and the International Green Building Code specifically with respect to commissioning. I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about ASHRAE.
Hello. If everyone wants to quickly take a look at this poll, but we're discussing is who's familiar with ASHRAE 202. Have you used that document in the past? Yes, did you have a question?
You're just saying you're familiar? That's
good. Oh, good. We have. So there's 42% B and 48% not familiar. So we have people who are somewhat familiar and not familiar. We're going to go into it in a little more depth here because 202 becomes the baseline for a lot of the following publications we're going to talk about. The 2813 NIBS Guideline 3 is also based upon this. So ASHRAE 202.
Is there a handout for this?
Yes. No.
Stephanie, is there?
I think I know we had a problem here. I believe we have one of the modules copied twice, and I don't think we have a handout for this one. I will get them to anybody who needs them after, just tell me and I will send them to you. I'm really sorry if you copy them.
So ASHRAE 202 goes through the commissioning process. It starts with the process at the beginning of the understanding of what the project's going to be with the owner's project requirement, and it's going to follow the process through to post-occupancy. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail as we move forward, but the purpose of 202 is that it's a process document. It identifies what's needed as a minimum for commissioning. It's a consensus document, so again, there's been a lot of feedback and input into how the document's created and what's listed. It does not address any technical issues. It does not go into what you need to do. It just says how you do the process. And it's going to be referenced again by different authorities and codes, and it doesn't address qualifications either. It's purely just what is the process of the commissioning, how do you go from the beginning to the end, and what is supposed to be included within that step by step. So when we start to look at standard, it provides, again, the procedures, the methods, the documentation required for each activity. It's going to go over the overview of the commissioning process, description of what each step requires, what are the minimum documentation requirements, and how do you accept it. So if we're going to lay out a series of steps, we also need to note how do we proceed to the next step. What is the acceptance of that level of effort, and what comes out of it, and we'll go into that as we break this down. But the ASTM Standard 202 goes through 17 different points. Those points become generally your general scope of work as a commissioning agent. It's going to talk about your basic design, the OPR, design reviews, construction observations, and as each of those steps gets identified and some sort of documentation is provided at the end of each of those steps. ASHRAE Standard 202 also has multiple appendixes. These appendixes provide samples of what a contracting commission process is, what the roles and responsibilities are, what the commissioning plan is. If you still have access to NIBS Guideline 3, it has more specific samples of what it might be for building enclosure work. ASTM 2013 has some similar, but not quite as in depth as NIBS.
Yeah.
So it's highly recommended that you Google NIBS. It's Guideline 3 as well. It's still out there because it is the annexes are very detailed and pretty important. But they're going to go through these different documentations.
Stephanie, that's all still on whole building design guide, right? NIBS Guideline 3?
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going anywhere.
No, it's finished together. It's an archive document. It won't be changed, but it does fail.
Yeah.
So, and one of the things in the beginning of the commission process, people always ask is, what's the issue log? What's the system manuals? Again, these provide some of those samples for people who may not be quite as familiar. But as we said, each activity is corresponding to a deliverable. So the owner's responsibility is to identify the contract requirements. The project requirements get turned into what the owner project requirements are. So that's going to become the basis of what the design is supposed to follow. The commissioning plan is going to create that OPR. The approach and the sequence that you're going to be following through the standard, the process becomes the commissioning plan, identifies the responsibilities of each of the parties and what their roles are going to be within the design and construction of the project. Once the architect's on board, those requirements and how the architect sees the project becomes the basic design. That basic design is going to be referred back to the OPR to make sure that each step along the way, that what the owner has set out for in the very beginning of the project is what's being provided at the end of the day. The plans and specs, that phase becomes the CDs, so become the construction documents or contract documents for the contractor. There are verification requirements, and those become reports, review documents. There are submittal reviews, become, again, review reports. It's important that each of these steps is followed and verified, and that there's a checklist, because as a commissioning agent, you're not responsible for the design, you're not responsible for the way it's put together, you're responsible to make sure that everyone's following the process and that there's a QA, QC verification that each of these steps is being taken. Construction observations become a checklist. Testing becomes, a non-conforming log. So what are those reports at the end of the day, at the end of the testing day, at the end of the site visit? How is that incorporated within the construction process? Each of those issues needs to be logged and needs to be tracked and closed out. At the end of the project, you start to get into system manuals. The system manuals is going to identify for the owner and the facility maintenance people what is the building made out of, what are the commissioning assembly components, and what are the documentations you need to be able to run those systems. There's going to be a training element here. A lot of these buildings are complicated. There's a lot of systems now that are involved. It's not just opening up a window. A lot of times things are controlled by a computer system or a very high-tech mechanical system. So you'd have a training program that identifies and shows the facility managers how to run the building, right? What are the things they need to do for annual maintenance and their problems or issues. So you have a training plan and report that provided. Typically, we actually like to put a video in there too. We've had a couple projects where the facility manager leaves within 6 months after you complete the project. So if you have that videotape, then in his follow-up or assistants later on can refresh themselves with it. The commissioning report ends up being a final report. In the post-occupancy operations, again, it's another report, but you're identifying any issues after occupancy that either weren't included or weren't made aware of, and you can try to come back and continue to evolve the project and the building to, again, work with what the owner's requirements are. So we step through this. The standard is for delivery of the project. Scopes can be defined by the owner in the owner project requirements and the CX plan. It's performed based on the extent of the commissioning effort to find the procedure. So the commissioning agent and the owner are going to decide how in depth we go, right? The commissioning 202 gives you the path, but you have to decide how much are you going to provide, how much is this going to cost, what type of services are you going to require. When we talk about testing later, whether it's field or lab testing, how much testing is going to be included. Those are all things that are identified early on in the commissioning plan. And each of those activities that you include need to have, again, a deliverable. How does it get, how do you move on to the next phase? How do you know that everything's been accepted? It's important to understand that the CXA is not required to accept it. The designer and the contractors are still responsible for the design and for the construction of the project, but what we're talking about is accepting each of the phases as we move forward, and that the process has been met, that the review comments have been addressed by the architect, or that the construction deficiencies have been addressed by the contractor. Not that they were correct or incorrect, but the fact that they were identified, people were made aware of, and they corrected those items or addressed them in one manner or another. Standard 202.5 goes into initiating the commissioning process. Does not address the party of the provider, so it doesn't identify who it is and what the requirements are, but it does provide, again, the process as follows. The owner is responsible to select a qualified CX process. Usually the later documents that we're going to review are going to identify some qualifications for what those different agents are going to need. This is more of the baseline that the later documentations are built on. Item 6 is the OPR. So during the pre-design phase, assuming that you have a commissioning agent brought on beforehand, you're identifying what the design is, what the building is going to consist of, documenting what that is within the OPR. The OPR should be included in the contract documents as informational only, but it really bases upon what the owner's contract requirements are. The owner wants to tie the architect and the contractor back to what they're looking for in their building. And we'll get into some OPR discussions later in the presentation. The commissioning plan, again, provides the organization of the process, identifies the commissioning players and their roles, the owner's roles, the designer's roles, the contractor's roles. It sets out what the process will be in order to meet the OPR requirements. The commissioning plan is going to provide the input from the owners to the project team. You develop that initial CX plan, but the plan is constantly changing. So as the project moves forward, as the basic design gets accepted, there may be changes to the plan. And some of the decisions that are made as you move along the process could change what the owner's requirements are. Maybe they reduce some of the performance requirements of the building because they want a very aesthetic value to the building, or that there is some cost issues and that starts to impact what the performance can be provided. So as things move along, your OPR goes back and you update it, and at the same time the commissioning plan is going to be updated. If you decide to go from a stick-built system to a prefab system, now your testing requirements may change. Maybe now you have to do lab testing. Those are things that are going to evolve as the project evolves and as the means of delivery of the project evolves. The basic design is, again, now that you start to enlarge the team, the design team, architect, construction engineer, and MEP engineers start to come on board, and they're going to start to take a look at what the OPR is and start to create the building, they need to come up with what their basic design is. And that basic design starts to include the assemblies and components that make up the building, and those components need to be tied back to the OPR. Do these systems provide the same performance requirements or characteristics that the owner is looking for within the OPR? The design team will submit the basic design to the owner and commissioning agent using milestones so that they can be reviewed. Typically, the design documents are reviewed for compliance to the OPR. The building enclosure, when we get in a little more detail later, we start to look at some industry standards as well, because the OPR sometimes is more performance driven and not necessarily specific to the way things should be put together. But the design is to evaluate the compliance. Are these details, is what's being provided system-wide matching up with what the owner's requirements are. Within the OPR, you want to identify how you're going to perform that review. What is the sampling strategy for design review? See some conflict on this, sometimes on a more statistical basis and using an MEP basis. You're looking at a certain percentage of the documentation. On the building envelope side, typically you're looking at 100% of it. So sampling is more of a general review. You may not be digging into each of the systems specifically, but if you skip the details, you skip the detail that's the leaking detail, it becomes an issue. And so you really need to identify early on what the depth of the review is and what the sampling strategies are for that, and what's going to be included within the design reviews. Design review commissioning shall not be considered a peer review or a code review. Right? These are independent reviews to confirm that the provided documents meet up with what the owner is expecting, not necessarily code requirements. And the design review or peer review typically leads you towards more of those structural elements where you're doing something outside of standard code elements, and that's not the case here. You're reviewing it purely as a comparison back to the OPR. The design team and the owner and the other responsible parties shall be responsible for the commissioning agent to document and review items that are brought up. So if you're bringing up items within those reviews, they need to be responded to in a manner that can be tracked. It's important that those modifications are included. Construction observations and testing allow for the proper installation, coordination, and commissioning testing to occur so that you can evaluate the construction and make sure that the construction is now providing elements that are in compliance with the basic design as well as the OPR, that the systems and assemblies are meeting those requirements. The commissioning agent is going to conduct kickoff meetings. Usually, once the contractor's on board and submittals have been provided, you want to sit down with the design team and the contractor and the subcontractors to start to look at the submittal packages as they come together. Typically, during the submittal process, each of the contractors is providing what they're providing, but now as a team, you want to make sure that they're interfacing so that, as Andrea said, the by others is addressed. You want to make sure that those items that two different trades are pointing fingers at each other, that items and those coordination issues get addressed. A lot of times too, that the design system, the design details may be based upon one form of sequence, and the contractor may propose a different sequence because of either time restraints, long lead times on materials, or just the matter of how they want to proceed with the project. Those sequencing changes could affect the way that the details work, and so the kickoff meeting allows you to start to identify issues and conflicts that the sequencing, that the way that the project was thought out may have caused above and beyond what the design documents are indicating. You also go over what the commission process is, what the responsibilities are, what you're doing with the process, how often is there going to be observations on site, what the testing requirements are, so that everybody on board understands what the intent is. Checklists are one of the documents that come out of the observations, construction testing. As part of the checklist, it doesn't say who performs those. Typically, we look at the contractors, subcontractors to provide their quality assurance and quality control processes and incorporate those within the checklist per se. The checklist also may include certain requirements from the manufacturer. The manufacturer requires certain temperatures, prep work, review of substrates. Those items that you want to make sure are taken and reviewed prior to the start of the new components can become part of those checklists. A lot of times you'll see in the construction site that the mason's being pushed, to follow up the air barrier installation, or the air barrier installation is being pushed to follow up the sheathing or the CMU backup walls. If those things are just pushed along because the sequence and the roll of construction has to keep moving without the due diligence and the quality review of those substrates, you may end up with inherent problems within the building. And so having a checklist kind of can slow the process down a little bit and make sure that people are taking the time to make sure that what they're going to be going over is acceptable and that they're doing it within acceptable climate or environmental controls that may be needed for those systems. The checklist data typically can be provided for the CX provided for review, not necessarily that you're on site each day checking off, but that the contractor has a quality control person who is performing that on a daily basis and tracking and logging the information for review. There are other agencies out there similar to like ABBA who might have their own systems for like air barrier installation. So you can utilize some of those as a checkpoint depending on the systems. Yes?
Looking at that bullet point there, the checklist data being submitted to the provider, CX provider for review. So is that the actual test data that, plus the checklist?
It's the checklist is...
Contractor or some other individual party is providing?
Yeah, it's gonna be visual observation. So for enclosure, I don't know, I'm assuming, maybe incorrectly, that a lot of you might be familiar with mechanical commissioning and non-enclosure commissioning, but if you think of like a pre-functional test for mechanical, that's really building observation for us. When you test the window, you test the window. You don't pre-test the window, generally, right? So that's gonna be just your visual observations, and you can structure it. What I think the standards are saying is that you can structure it however you like. You can have someone from your firm go out there and do the checklists. Generally, what I like to do and what I think works well is to have the subcontractors work on those lists. So you've reviewed them, you, the provider, have reviewed them, or your team has reviewed them. They are tracking them. I just have them keep them on site so that we can review them when we're there.
Because that was my confusion, and we also, the provider also witnesses, so.
So the testing, yeah. So the testing is not the checklist. That's separate.
A lot of this, the process itself is, again, it's a process document. So who's responsible for each of these items is up to the contract, and how that's divvied up from the owner. So is the commissioning agent going to be there full time and are they providing that services, or is that something that the OP, they may have an owner's project manager who's going to be on site to observe and document some of that. They might be responsible to put some of these forms together. Sometimes the contractor or the subcontractors could be responsible. So who that falls on really needs to be decided during the beginning of the commissioning process. We see two different things. One is the commissioning agent's on-site observations, which may create a deficiency log of items that need to be addressed or reviewed for that week or period to the next visit. Subsequently, we also see an actual checklist, and usually it's more on the federal government side where they really like those checklists that you can check off and submit and hand in. Those checklists, usually we start with the subcontractors, making sure the subcontractor has their own QA/QC process. We find out what are you guys going to do, and then we add to it. And we'll add to it things that the manufacturer may require, things that we in our experience may have found issues with, and say, well, it's best if we also add these in there. But it's a process that is usually collaborative to create that checklist, and then it's usually a team effort to follow up. But ideally, QA/QC should be with the subcontractor, and it's best as part of their process that then is reviewed by the commissioning agent.
What actually,
I
Rob?
think what you said made a lot of sense. That developed in my mind, and I was able to follow that.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to make sure we're clear. There's kind of three things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's the checklists, which are their own thing, let's say. Those are literally checklists. They can be completed by anyone, really. You just have to decide in the plan who's going to complete them, the regularity with which they'll be completed, and then the provider needs to make sure that they're actually being done, and they need to review the lists. There's typically going to be on-site presence by the provider's team. That may or may not have really anything to do with the checklist. They may come and say, yeah, I see you're doing that checklist, great. Also, I noticed this detail over here, it's not on your checklist that we need to address. They're gonna write that report. And then there's testing, performance testing, so water penetration resistance testing, air penetration resistance testing, flood testing at your roof, electronic leak detection, all of that. And that's kind of a third thing. So there's kind of three different things we're talking about here. Does that help everyone?
Yeah, I was looking at it as building the documentation. That's going to serve as
Yeah.
a checklist.
All the items that are brought up, whether it's checklists or observations or testing information, needs to be formally issued, and it also needs to have a resolution log. So we want a log to track to make sure that as things are observed or noted, that they're also closed out. Whether that is in full agreement with what those comments are, or whether it's a non-agreement, or at least is some sort of addressment to the item, and the resolution is provided and accepted by the owner. As the project starts near to the end, you're going to start to put together the systems manual. The responsibility of putting that manual together can vary among a lot of different parties. A lot of times we see that as part of the closeout package that the contractor provides to the commissioning agent and the OPM, if there is one, and that system manuals then can be updated and fine-tuned from the commissioning point of view and provided as a systems manual to the owner. So it doesn't, again, specify who develops it, but it's important that that information is identified early on in the commissioning process so that if it's a contractual requirement, that it's provided to the right party. The training, as we said before, it's important that the occupants know how to run the systems that they're going to be operating. Obviously, from an MEP point of view, it's really important and tends to be much more complicated than the building envelope, but the building envelope still has components that need to be reviewed. Things like roof warranties require annual or biannual inspections. Window systems or control systems may need to be tweaked or adjusted seasonally. So anything that's on the building facade or roof or waterproofing that have maintenance should be listed and identified. and so that the right people can be trained in what it is. It's also usually very helpful to identify what the different systems are, because a lot of times the maintenance guys won't know what's under the roof membrane. What is that system made out of, or what's behind my cladding? They don't know what that system is. So identifying what those are so that they're aware of it, so that if there's issues in the future, they know how to address it is important. The training is supposed to outline instructional topics as far as what is included, learning objectives, the value of the training, structural qualifications, training material, training reports. These should all be transferred into the specifications for commissioning and the responsibility to different parties to put them together. Typically, the putting together training manual and program is a joint group between the commissioning agent, the owner's representatives, as well as the contractor, with the assistance of the different subcontractors. Archiving this is important so that it can be reviewed later, whether it's hard copy or something like a videotape. Can be very useful for future maintenance people. The commissioning process doesn't stop when the building's turned over. There's a post-occupancy phase, and then ongoing commissioning. And the intent is that as large projects, large buildings are maintained and lived in, that there is an ongoing process that the facility people are performing. Prior to that, the post-occupancy, what you want to do is take a look at the building prior to the end of the warranty period, whether it's the contractor's guarantee, 1 or 2 years, or whether it's the system. Typically, we see these as being the 10-month warranty that LEED requires, or it might be a 23-month inspection, but whatever that period of guarantee is, you want to take a look at the building, make sure that it's still performing the way it's supposed to be, and that it's addressing the owner's needs before those warranties and guarantees are over, because that is the opportunity to get the contractors back on board to make anything addressed when it's not necessarily additional cost to the owner. As part of the closeout documents, the commissioning agent is going to provide a report. The report documents the commissioning process. It's going to include the design reviews, the on-site reviews, any checklists, field reports that are provided, any test results. Most importantly, that the issues and resolution logs through the design and construction phase were provided, that they were tracked, and that they were resolved. And at the end of the day, you want to note any issues that were incomplete or modifications to the process that might change from the original OPR. The different appendixes, we said, provide some information as far as responsibilities and who's providing documentations. Some of the other guidelines, like Guideline 3 from NIBS, usually a little bit more detail and more specific to the building envelope than ASHRAE 202 is. Appendix D goes into the OPR, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later, but usually you want to have at least 5 minimum participants, which is the operations group, the finance group, but people who are paying for it, right? Because usually there's a cost limit on the project. You want to have the users involved, because they're even the ones who are going to be occupying the space and using it. O&M for what the operation and maintenance of the building would be. Usually you want to have similar systems to what if there's existing buildings on campus, that they're following similar systems and assemblies. Facility planners and managers, and then anyone involved with the interiors. The OPR background is typically going to include the narrative description, objectives, identifying the goals for success. If it's a green building concept, is it LEED requirement or green globes or some other system that you're trying to get a certain amount of points in. The functional use of the building, so what's the duration, lifespan of the building, what is the anticipated maintenance costs, the performance criteria. Do you want to discuss the maintenance requirements for the building? You want a low maintenance or high maintenance building? Maybe the owner had problems on a previous project and they want to avoid those problems in this project, so there's an opportunity to bring those up. And we really don't like mold. We had this big moldy building in the last one we built. Let's avoid mold. So different things you want to list here. There might be occupant requirements, could be temperature or humidity issues. So if you're doing maybe a hospital, a surgical room may have a high humidity, so the occupant require a certain interior condition that needs to be provided by the enclosure. It's a living document, and it will change and be modified as it goes through the design process. It's important that, again, that it's tracked and changed, and the owner approves those changes as you move through. The appendix is going to include commission plan samples, but basically in the commission plan you can identify your pre-design activities, design, construction, occupancy operations, contacts of the people on the team, construction schedule, design schedule, important elements as well, and just how that process goes from A to B. So with that, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper into more building envelope specific information.
Yeah, so those tasks that Brian just went through are going to remain consistent, generally speaking, except that we're going to start to talk about them in the context of the building enclosure. But in general, the tasks are the tasks for commissioning, right? You have closeout documents, you have OPR, you have commissioning plan. That's true for 2813. I don't know how many folks in the room are actually familiar with 2813. If you want to let me know. But as we said before, 2813 and ASHRAE 202 have actually been kind of parallel if you look at the history documents. For folks in the room who have maybe not been present in either of those committees, there is cross-pollination and discussion about, you know, what's ASHRAE 202 doing here? What do we want to do? And then obviously 2813, as I'll show you in a second, has some pretty significant references to 202. So that process is the process, whether or not we're talking about mechanical, enclosure, electrical, whatever. All right. So a few folks are familiar, quite a few. Or let's say a few folks have done a project with 2813, quite a few have not. The 2813 establishes two specific enforceable levels of BECx, so it gets into some really specific numbers of activities that you need to complete in those enforceable levels. So 202 gave us all the activities. We're going to talk about certain numbers and when you have to do them and things like that in 2813. It gets a little bit more specific. The process is per 202. You can see this is just a quick sample. You can see how many times we're referencing 202. These are from the footnotes of 2813. So that process is intended to be consistent. I do think that one note in terms of alignment is I think it's a little bit, as you move from the process, which is independent from our disciplines, and you start to move into disciplines and you start to think about technical aspects of those disciplines, alignment is not necessarily always parallel. It's kind of yes and. Yes, we are doing 202, and when you're doing enclosure, here are the things you need to worry about. So that's kind of how I've always viewed that alignment process working in 2813. So if you are going to go through the document, rather than being organized by tasks, which 202 is, 2813 is organized by phases. The phases are listed kind of roughly chronologically as if you were to do a design, bid, build project. It is not intended to preclude other project delivery methods, but that is the organization of the document. So we talk about pre-design, design, schematic design, design development, pre-construction, construction, occupancy, and operations.
Ma'am,
Yes.
could you back up a slide? Could you talk a little bit about what you, one more, you mentioned fundamental and enhanced.
Yes.
And of course, that's a lead concept.
Yes.
We hear that thrown out a lot. Oh, I just want fundamental, I want enhanced. How do you define the difference when it comes to BECx between fundamental and enhanced? What's the dividing line?
So real quick, let me talk about the lead thing, and then we're about to get into fundamental versus enhanced in 2013. So lead talks about fundamental and enhanced. And lead's language, if you look at it, is talking about overall commissioning, fundamental commissioning and enhanced commissioning. In fundamental, they do have some building enclosure tasks, and we'll get into this more later, but basically develop an OPR, develop a BOD, and do a design review. And that's it. There's nothing beyond the design phase. And you only even have to do one design review. I mean, it doesn't even say you have to make sure that things are resolved. Obviously, I think anyone in this room would, but it's really limited. But that is part of the idea that you're doing a fundamental commissioning. So there's mechanical and electrical tasks that I'm not even looking at that point. If you move into enhanced with leads, you want to get additional credits. There are multiple paths. One of them is what they refer to as enclosure commissioning. So that looks a little bit more like what we think of as enclosure commissioning at its base level. But it does not align at all, as we'll see in a minute, with 2813 fundamental is not is not LEED fundamental. 2813 fundamental meets and probably exceeds enhanced credit for enclosure commissioning under LEED. It is confusing. We have talked about this quite a bit. The challenge is that using the terms fundamental and enhanced makes a lot of sense, just that people conflate it with the LEED, and it gets real hard for folks. So, we talked about it in the committee. We'll jump back to the major elements of 2813, and we'll get to fundamental versus enhanced in a minute here. So these major elements look pretty much the same as ASHRAE 202, as I mentioned. We're not going to go through all of them again. Brian did a great job. But they're going to be the same types of elements. There's a little bit as you shift from general or as you shift from really mechanical, which kind of enclosure commissioning came after, followed mechanical commissioning, and you'll see some vestigial things like LEED still says seasonal training, or seasonal testing, which we don't really have seasonal testing per se, unless you have a dynamic facade. So you'll see kind of there's some vestigial things. So there's some terminology that shifts a little bit, but there's always that analogous piece that goes back to 202 and to the kind of core commissioning. But these look pretty much the same. When you talk about fundamental BECx, there's a couple of specific requirements. One is when you're going to engage your provider. You need to engage them during the design phase. You can engage them up through DD, which means that you may be doing basically a retroactive OPR, because at that point, probably a lot of project requirements have been set. They probably just haven't been written down. So you're not doing the initial development necessarily with the owner as you might if you were hired during pre-design. So fundamental, you're engaged during design. You do still do an OPR. It may be retroactive. You have a minimum of 1 independent design review. Typically that's going to occur during the CD phase towards maybe 75, 80%. Maybe later. Sometimes the detailed development for enclosure doesn't strictly follow those percentages. And then you're going to have a minimum level of performance testing, which is listed in the annex. You're still going to have, the standard still talks about having involvement in submittal review, construction phase, post-occupancy phase, but these are the real specific numbers and timelines. If you move over to enhanced, you're going to need to engage your provider earlier. They're going to need to be engaged during pre-design. Now, if you don't engage them during pre-design, you can still do all this other stuff and do a retroactive OPR, but technically you're no longer enhanced. You need a minimum of 3 independent design reviews, typically SD, DD, CD. Minimum level of performance testing is more. You're going to have, instead of 1 window test, you're going to have 3 window tests, let's say. I don't think either of the minimum performance levels of testing are particularly onerous. I've asked multiple times in our group, our task group that meets, is this more than what you guys are doing? And I would say generally we're saying it's bare minimum of what we think should be done in the testing. I will caveat that with I agree, I continue to work on the table. I think it's very confusing. Folks look at that list and they think you have to do everything on that list. That's not true. If anyone would like to walk through the list, you can just reach out to ASTM. They'll put you in touch with me, but get my card and I can go through it with you. So again, we have the building enclosure commissioning provider, the person they're responsible charge. They're going to form a group. This is from really to the team in the standard. If you're familiar with the standard, this recently changed. Commissioning is a group activity. It involves the owner, it involves the contractor, it involves the designer, it involves everybody. The group, though, is specifically referring to the commissioning people that the provider brings on, their specific team that is doing commissioning. And the reason why you might have a group rather than just one provider is that there are kind of some substantial core competencies that this group needs to bring to the table. And I'm going to go through them with you. This document speaks both specifically and a little bit generally. It does leave it to the owner to determine if their provider is qualified, their provider and their group in total is qualified. But it does speak to the things that we believe you need to know in order to perform enclosure commissioning. When we go through them, I think you'll see that there's times when maybe one person can handle it all, or maybe they need to bring in experts in other areas to fill out their group. So in general, the core competencies are in building and material science, procurement and project delivery, contract documents and construction administration, and performance test standards and methodology. And this should also look a little bit familiar to you if you've been looking at our course outline, because our course outline is looking at these core competencies and using that as a guidepost. So building and materials science, you need to understand the principles of heat transfer, moisture storage and transport, durability, behavior of materials in a particular geographic climate, the structural principles associated with loading. You should understand how wind loads are going to affect your building or your enclosure. And what I think we'll start to notice as we work our way through these is that what I find to be true in my practice, I may be very qualified in this for a particular project and need to bring in additional resources for another project. So I'm very comfortable in a mixed human climate. That's where I do most of my work. If I were to move to an Arctic climate for a project, even though I understand the core principles of building science and building physics, I would want someone who's pretty familiar with Arctic construction to be on my team. But sort of understanding that as the provider and the person in charge, I need to know enough to be able to discuss with that person and understand what's going on and manage them really as part of the team. Procurement and project delivery, I think really simply put, you need to understand how the project is going to be contracted and delivered. That affects your commissioning plan, that affects how you're going to deliver building enclosure commissioning, that affects, basically how you're going to do building enclosure commissioning on your project. One thing that comes up a lot for folks is the idea that I've heard commissioning in general and then specific building enclosure commissioning not well suited to design build projects. Doesn't work. And there are definitely challenges. Absolutely. But I think if you start to go through the process and you are a well-informed provider and you have this expertise, you can look at these other delivery methods and these unusual contracting, and I'll go ahead and throw in government and multi-agency and all of that, throw that right in there for alternate contracting because it's its whole own special method of delivery. If you can understand those methods of delivery, you can go ahead and write a commissioning plan that is going to address what you need for your project, provided that the owner gives you sufficient time in the project, you're brought on early enough to actually affect change, and sufficient latitude to actually work that. In fact, I would say if you're talking about design build, again, very challenging because what happens is generally they don't bring us in until they're way late. OPR is set before they put out the RFP for the design build contractor. We're not brought in until they've started to design, which means everything's bought. The owner wanted stuff that didn't make it into the RFP. We're trying to help them navigate that, and it's hard. Best case scenario, it's hard. Worst case scenario, it can be a hot mess. If, however, you're able to navigate that successfully with your owner, educate your owner, move through that, or they've brought you on early enough, I think there's a lot of opportunities for commissioning to enhance the design build process. So if the architect works under the contractor, there's a lot of concern that means that the architect doesn't have the same voice with the owner. Well, you have a direct line to the owner to talk about building enclosure performance, so you can potentially help to elevate that process. You also have the opportunity, if you're brought in early, to meet the contractor and get their buy-in very, very, very early on, which we all know is the best way to get to a successful commission project. Construction documents and contract administration. Again, I think this one can be really succinctly put in that the contract documents are the vehicle for the OPR throughout construction. If you would like it to be built to meet the OPR, then it should be reflected in the contract documents, which means the provider needs to understand how they work. And that sounds simple, but once you start to get into either unique contracting methods, and I keep pointing at you because you brought up the federal government, and I think the federal government is particularly special, at least in my work with them. So there's maybe different things you need to be aware of about contracting there. But you also need to understand, RFIs and change orders and sort of all those things, not just as the provider, but as your team who might be executing these things for you needs to have this expertise as well, or sufficient oversight to make sure that they're getting everything where it needs to be. Performance test standards and methodology, I think this is pretty self-evident. At the end of the day, maybe the architect knows some of the tests they want, maybe even the owner does. Maybe they just put in the ones that you told them last time because you've worked with them before. But at the end of the day, the provider needs to understand the performance tests that are being used for the building enclosure. And they need to understand how they should be executed, and they need to be able to evaluate and bring onto their team technical staff that can execute them properly on the project. So in addition to everything that we talked about in 202, those are some of the specifics that 2813 kind of layers on top of the tasks we talked about in 202. I'm going to talk a little bit about 2947 and how that document works and some of the additional things that are layered in there. That's the companion guide for the standard for building enclosure commissioning. So how many folks have heard of this document, used this document, have any familiarity? It doesn't count if you've only heard about it when I told you earlier tonight.
Did you read the link at the bottom?
Oh, sure. It's ARDG.participoll, PARTICIPOLL.com. So a lot, okay, thank you for being honest. A lot of you didn't know about it. Okay, so great. I think this is gonna be some new information to some folks. Some folks, this is gonna be maybe a little something you already know about. The standard was developed as a direct evolution of Guideline 3, as we've discussed already. Guideline 3 remains on whole building design guide. I'm pointing over towards Stephanie. I've been told it's gonna live there in archive, as Stephanie mentioned. There's a lot of valuable information there, but it's no longer being updated. It's kind of a moment in time. And the memorandum of agreement really was intended to push that information over into an apparatus, ASTM, that can continue to update the standard through a consensus process moving forward. That's where we get 2013, and then 2947, kind of the more direct descendant of the Guideline 3. It's a companion for the standard practice. We've actually, because it came second, there's still kind of some coordination between the two. There were a few things that maybe were pushed to non-mandatory information in the standard that are more appropriately housed in the guide now that we have it as a document. And just a quick little, for those of you who are familiar and may notice that sometimes there's a little bit of misalignment in, say, terminology, or there's a little bit of repetition that isn't quite the same between the two standards. So just a little insight, peek behind the curtain into the ASTM process. These two standards are balloted separately, always balloted separately. We, for example, would like to migrate optional testing. Something we've talked about, I should say, is migrating optional testing to the guide, because it's optional. So why do we have it in the standard anyway? It's not, it's all non-mandatory. There's a whole list of just optional tests. If we migrate it to the guide, the process that we've figured out in order to avoid just losing information, right? Because we think that is a handy list, is we duplicate it in the guide. We get that ballot passed. Then we delete it from the standard and we get that ballot passed. And anyone who's ever sat in the room for a consensus document knows this is not a quick process. This is not even 1 year. That's probably minimum 2 years to get that to happen. So, so just kind of a little behind the scenes of how that works, and something we've been doing as a committee is trying to make sure that there's clear separation of information and minimal repetition to avoid inconsistencies between the two documents, so that we can kind of keep each document, do all of our housekeeping for each document separately, and not have as many concerns about that alignment. So that's a little deep dive into that process, but I think it's interesting. I was very interested to learn that you could not just concurrently ballot these two companion documents, but that is how it is. So the guide describes and provides guidance for the two levels of building enclosure commissioning. So it doesn't define the two levels as they're defined in the standard. It provides guidance. Goes into depth on potential team members you can add. So the guide is actually where you can read about the specialist and the technologist. In the standard, we just talk about the group. You have a provider, and they're going to hire some people. Those people are going to have specialized expertise, or they're going to work under them to be in the field, or what have you. And all together, they're qualified per the core competencies, and the provider's in charge. They're the project manager. They're the They're the one who is on the hook. The guide talks about who might some of those people be. So you might have a specialist, maybe you have a really complex curtain wall job, you bring on a guru in that area. They're not doing all the provider stuff, they're just looking at curtain wall for you, and you're managing that and incorporating them appropriately. You may have a technologist, you probably will have a technologist, particularly on a bigger job. You might have two. You may have someone who's doing all the enclosure testing, you may have someone else who's doing the roof, you may have a third person who's doing whole building air. You may have smaller jobs where you really are doing it all or nearly all yourself. You may be hiring other firms, or you may just be picking people from within your firm to be on this group. I may be the provider in a project, maybe we're looking at curtain wall, so I'm bringing in David Green because he's really good at that. Maybe I also need someone who does acoustics. We don't really do that in-house, at least not to the extent they want, so I'm hiring a firm for that. Those people are both my specialists. Maybe I'm hiring a testing firm to do whole building air, but I have Lance doing the windows in-house, and so they're both technologists. It's just the process, and I'm still responsible for all of them, whether they are in my firm, not in my firm. I'm still the provider, I'm still in responsible charge. For that reason, the provider should have a kind of sufficiently broad and deep level of knowledge. They're not going to be as deep as some of these gurus, but you need to understand what's going on with your team. You need to have a pretty substantial level of technical understanding in order to be an effective leader for that team. The guide also includes flowcharts for the phase processes and talks about continuing CX for active facades. The flowcharts continue to be updated. There's other things from Guideline 3. People love the appendixes from Guideline 3. We're in the process of continuing to migrate those over. Again, I think the consensus process is very helpful. I could write a standard. None of you would probably ever follow it because why would you? You had no input and maybe I got some things wrong. So I think having the consensus process is excellent, but it is also very slow. And then it's the direct, we've said already, really is intended to be the direct evolution of Guideline 3 and the one that's being updated. Okay, there we go. It also talks about specifically best practices for the party of your provider. So we mentioned before, 202 doesn't talk about who your provider has to work for. Neither does 2813. I don't know why 202 leaves it off because I'm not sitting in those discussions, but in 2813, we felt it was inappropriate for the standard to define contractual obligation. However, we also feel that it's good to have an independent person. There may be some firms who truly can have an in-house person who has sufficient independence and power, really, to make comments and make sure that those are heard directly by the owner. But there's a level of independence that is necessary to really gain the benefit from this process. And so we talk about that in the guide. What's a best practice there? And in fact, actually, if you're familiar with the older standard, we removed the requirement for a third party for the design review. Do not say that because that's a contractual obligation. We do talk about the best practice for that in 2947. But we could basically all think of a firm that we've worked with that truly, yes, they do design, they truly have an independent team. We would be okay. We would think they would be able to provide this process valuably, even though technically they're all the same company. So we sort of felt that the owner should get to decide that with, again, the guidance in the guide. The other thing that this talks about is really best practices for existing relationships. So obviously we're always obligated to talk with our owners or any of our clients about conflict of interest, meaning our company works for two parties on the same project. That's a conflict of interest. The guide really looks to a higher level of disclosure and information for the owner in terms of best practice. Not just disclosing conflict of interest, but educating your owner about other existing relationships that we have on the project, making sure that we've done sort of the appropriate soul searching ourselves and that we're able to, on this project, regardless of our other commitments, not on this project, but outside these other relationships, provide the service that is required for the provider. Meaning, if we work for the contractor a lot, they're our biggest client, and it's actually going to be very challenging for us to be writing reports, and that's going to be poorly received, and they're going to be able to call people higher above us within the company, we need to really think about what that's going to look like. So it's kind of a higher level. I think maybe looking toward more avoiding even the appearance of conflict, or at least disclosing even the appearance of conflict to the owner is discussed as a best practice. The other thing I think that really comes up here actually is when the owner starts to say, I just want you guys to do it all. I just want you to do everything. And that's great. That feels great. They really trust us, and we think we're pretty qualified. And I think I'm pretty good at building enclosure. That's all I do all the time. I'm not also doing other design. So I think I'm really good at it. However, if I'm really doing everything, I'm not providing them the service of this independent review. I'm not providing them an independent design review. I'm not giving them that second opinion. I'm doing too much, and it's not really the commissioning process anymore. It's something else that may be good and maybe they like, but it's not this process anymore. And so being honest with the owner about when we can do that, or being honest with the owner if they want to ask me about something, I want you guys to do everything. I want you guys to do acoustics. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to hire someone to do acoustics. Being honest about our in-house capabilities as well, and making sure that we're bringing the right people to the table as the provider. I think there's a very strong responsibility to the owner in that role. So again, what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take a minute to test you guys to see if you fell asleep while Brian was talking about all those tasks. Brian and he's gonna talk about something more exciting later. He's gonna talk about testing.
Pictures.
But yeah, new pictures. But the documents are hard to liven up. So what kind of questions would you guys ask an owner in an OPR? And some of you may have, I don't know everyone's level. I don't know if you've all developed an OPR before. So you get the stakeholders in the room, you're having a workshop. What kinds of questions are you gonna have on your list to make sure get answered, or you're gonna use to facilitate the discussion to figure out what the owner actually wants? Any ideas?
Life expectancy.
Life expectancy? Yeah, that's a good one.
Ownership expectancy.
Ownership expectancy, yeah. How long are you gonna hold the building? Absolutely.
Warranty lengths.
Yes, those are all good.
Budget.
Budget.
Commonality to other facilities. Campuses a lot of times will have design standards.
Sure. Yeah, what do you have in place that we need to be aware of? Absolutely.
Maintenance requirements.
Maintenance requirements. Yeah, I was thinking about maintenance intervals too. Like obviously you're gonna have to maintain this building, and obviously no one is gonna tell you I want like a high maintenance building. And yeah, I want an expensive one that's high maintenance, but understanding what's your tolerance for upfront costs and how frequently you're gonna actually be able to maintain these things. But about
Brian brought up a
Yeah.
good point about, once you do your commissioning, coming back, not just see somebody from mechanical, but you brought up body controls and tuning them, and maybe after you've been in use, we're after
Yeah, and I think that crossover too, if you have like a daylighting requirement and that's tied in with the lighting controls, or if you have, a lot of times when we talk about specific use, and you brought this up like a hospital, a lot of the specifics, or at least an entire category of the specifics that the occupants need are really tied in with the mechanical and electrical system. So we have daylighting or glare requirements, or we have specific humidity control requirements. That's gonna also require things to happen on the building enclosure that are very much related, but are maybe not, if you're not thinking about it or you're not trained to ask those questions, you're not asking them about that, right? But yeah, those are very important. Anybody have anything else before we move on to
Past experience.
past experiences? Good. Yeah.
I have a question that's
Yeah.
prior to you getting to this point.
Yes.
Kind of relates to what you're asking.
Yeah.
As an owner, I can see where the building enclosure commissioning is so important. But my question as an owner is, why isn't it already covered under my AIA contract with the architect and with the contractor? That's the first question.
Yep.
And the second question is, as an owner, if I hire a good architect with a good project manager, he's on top of it already. He's already there. So as an owner, why wouldn't I, if I'm in a new area, the first person I'd want to hire would be a project manager that's going to handle the building enclosure commissioning process, and then he's going to get the input in selecting the architect and the contractor. Anyway, that's kind of a That's a two-faceted question, and I'd like, I mean, as an owner, I'd like to hear what the architect said put on that.
First question is, didn't I already pay for this, basically, right? And I think that's a valid question. To some extent, I mean, you did, right? The architect owes you your requirements. They should be in the contract documents, and the contractor should build them. What is my experience, and let me caveat this. My experience tends to be that I am not called in on the jobs that we have done a bunch of times, and the contractor really has details down, and it's easy, and there's no problems. Tend to be on projects that are going to be more complex, they're mission critical. The owner has gotten burned real bad in the past, and they had a lot of water, and they never want to repeat that again. So for whatever reason, the owner either wants additional assurance about delivery with respect to the building enclosure, or for whatever reason, the owner wants additional assurance. My experience working with those teams is with really good architects and contractors. They're bringing a lot to the table, but they have so much on their plate, and their expertise with respect to building enclosure is just not as deep. And so I have never ended up on a project where I'm not still finding concerns and highlighting them. The best case scenario, I'm highlighting concerns, and the rest of the team is saying, explain that to me, or yes, I see what you found here. Either I haven't dealt with this in the past, what do you suggest? And then we charrette about it. Or, hey, actually, we had that problem. That was a problem on our last project. Here's what we did. What do you think about that? So, I mean, I don't know what else to say for the industry besides that it just seems to be the case. Now, I'm a building enclosure consultant, so my experience is, I'm not an architect, so I can't speak for all the jobs that they don't hire me on. But that's my experience on those projects, is that there's always something that can be improved upon. And sometimes, a lot of times, I find that architects have still not completely brought their details up to speed with current practice and current detailing. And so there's still things that we're pulling where we don't have a continuous air barrier here. And as the enclosure's gotten tighter, and as the materials have become less moisture tolerant, I live in a brick masonry building, and if there is a little bit of water, it's not really a huge problem because it's brick, and it's not causing major damage. If you have that on new construction where you have OSB sheathing or Dunstack, and you have moisture getting behind your weather barrier, and you have multiple layers of paint on the inside, and nothing is ever drying, it's a whole different problem for the owner. So tolerances are very different, I think. I want to be clear, I've worked with a lot of great architects and contractors, so I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, I guess, as I'm hedging a little bit. But I think tolerances have changed, and the risk factor is higher in what we're doing now. We want really great energy performance. We're adding foam. It's not allowing for the drying potential we used to have. We have materials that are significantly less moisture tolerant. Everything's a trade-off. And then your second question was kind of related to that. What else do I need to hit on?
Why not hire the building enclosure consultant first and have them select? It's been my experience, if you get a good architect and a good contractor, all this stuff is under the radar because they take care of it. They're good, they're good at what they do, and they know they're good, and they're on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's excellent.
So it's under the radar, you don't even know they're paying for it. I mean, it's preventative design and preventative construction.
Yeah, I think if you're in a position as an owner too to continue to work with the same teams that are good, and you are looking at their costs as best value rather than trying to go, competitive bid and having them, go with the lowest bidder, then I think that you may be in a different position. That's excellent that that's been your experience.
Now, as far as going in and including that as part of your AIA, you're asking if the architect doesn't include that as part of the AIA agreement that you have with them. When you're doing your professional selection, if you include that as part of your contract with that architect,
then it's up to them to make sure that they're covering that. And if they don't have this special, if they don't have that specialist in their group, then they will go in and they will actually bring someone in for you that will include that. So make sure that you're putting that in your contract with your architect. It's up to the owner to actually define all of this. And that owner is really who owns and is trying to assess those risks, right? So if you put that in your contract with both your architect and with, that owner is the only person that has contracts with those two groups directly, right? They don't have contracts with each other. So it's up to that owner to be educated well enough so that they can actually, tell these two groups what it is that they want. I think that's how you indicate that.
Yeah, and I don't think, I'm just gonna say, every building does not necessarily need enclosure commissioning. Your architect may be hiring someone to do some of these tasks for them under the radar. They may have a consultant who's doing some of this. They may have truly in-house people who this is what they do, and so they have sort of in-house consultants who do this. Every project does not require enclosure commissioning. That is not the intent of this program, to say that every project out there needs to have enclosure commissioning. This is a quality additive process. Portions of this process are found in most kind of enclosure consultants services. So you can buy certain portions of this. You can run certain portions of this through your contract. Your contractor could be hiring them. I get hired by Clark Construction all the time. I don't know to what extent when we get hired how much they talk to the owner about that or not. So I don't know who all in the owner said. They say, oh yeah, and by the way, we've brought on Miss Janie. They may just, that's part of their process. So I think it just depends on what you're looking for. It depends on what your experiences are. It depends on also what your contracting practices are. If you can just vet a team and keep working with them, you're in a really different position than someone who has to competitively bid. They're an organization that they're required to have really specific fairness standards, and they have to go with X, Y, and Z on the bid, and you don't know who you're getting as a result of that. Well, maybe because you can't select your team as much as you would like to, you do want this because, for the contractor, you're getting the low bid.
The ASHRAE guidelines also usually start with the commission process being first, the design team being hired after the fact. But a lot of times you'll see in the ASTMs 2013 as well as LEED, the commissioning or enclosure person doesn't have to be on board until the DDs. And that's a lot of times what you're seeing is that the envelope commissioning agent may start later than the ideal ASHRAE process. And all it works, you just want to get brought in early enough where you can have input still.
Well, and actually what we should have said is, when you said, should I hire the commissioning person first? I should have just said thumbs up, yes, absolutely. That's a great process. If you're gonna go through this process, bringing that person on early is gonna give them maximum influence.
Well, to your question, I think it's important to have this discussion ahead of time.
Yeah.
And in the open, because we've been on projects where the architect had an envelope consultant working for them. General contractor's got an envelope consultant working for them. We're working for the overall commissioning provider, we're a subcontractor performing both the enclosure commissioning. So there's 3 enclosure professionals on the job. And quite frankly, I think that might, this is a personal opinion, that it might lead to a little sloppiness in that, the architect's enclosure consultant, he's going to catch it, or the contractor's consultant is going to catch it. But so anyway, there's 3 of them. Who's in charge? Number one, if I was an owner, I'd say, who's in charge? Who's got the responsibility? But you've got to remember too, as an owner, that everybody's got their agenda. The contractors, enclosure consultants really be looking hard at the details for buildability and hopefully we won't have any leaks. The architects, enclosure consultant is, could be looking for the good of the project, but he'll be looking out for the architect's interest, if you will. So, it's kind of a shame to have 3 professionals, and I don't really. You might be a situation where you're in conflict with each other, but by the same token, if there's, I mean, who do you defer to in that case? That's what I want to ask as an owner.
Well, and that should
Not
be,
paying for the same service 3 times.
well, one, that should be in the plan, right? I mean, you should have talked about that. And two, I don't want to, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I do think that's an important point. One, the plan, which can be updated at any time, can address these things. And I would say, based on what we're talking about with the responsibilities, the provider should address, to some extent, that communication, right? I mean, you're not responsible for what happens internally in the design team necessarily, but there is communication happening throughout the team that you need to make sure gets in the plan. I know it's not always perfect. But the other thing I do want to point out, and I agree, I think there's challenges, and we want to avoid duplicating services for the owner, so that the overall project can be cost efficient. But it does bear in mind too that the commissioning provider is not a design consultant, and they are not a construction consultant. You know, we're not going to be hiding the ball. We're not like, yeah, I don't know, there's an air leak, that's a problem for you, architect, go figure it out. We're going to try to help. But we're not providing them with details the way that I might if I'm working for the architect. I may sketch up a significant number of details for them. I may even write spec sections for them. Aside from the commissioning spec, we're not doing that as a commissioning provider. If you're doing that, you're kind of undercutting the process. You're not independent anymore. So 3 consultants, I agree, there are a lot of challenges there, and that's a good discussion to have, but just bear in mind that the commissioning provider has a real specific role. They represent, they're tied to the owner, not the design team and not the contractor, in terms of their contracting and their responsibility. And there is some narrowness in terms of how much assist we're providing to either the architect or the contractor. We want them to be successful. We're not trying to hide the ball, but we are also not there to charrette their problems with them. We're there to tell them this is an issue, and they have teams who are going to fix the issue.
Well,
Yeah.
Getting more to the discussion, that's where you've got to sit down early on and to
Absolutely.
find out who roles are. There ought to be a discussion between, hosted by the owner, between those 3 different groups to make sure there's not overlap and stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That should be in the plan. I mean, that should be very clearly in the plan.
You make a
Absolutely.
good point about, and I was alluding to that earlier.
Yeah.
The architect will have a consultant, but it's looking out for the owners.
Exactly.
And for the architect's interest, which might be more design related. The contractor will have his consultant, which is probably looking more toward buildability issues. And then, as you mentioned, the commission provider ought to be agnostic, looking out for the owner's interests, beyond details and whatnot. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I think you bring up a good point, which is, I think if you listen to everything we've talked about and you try to summarize it, the commissioning provider needs to bring a substantial level of organization, tracking, and technical expertise to the job. And so we talk about, well, this is a problem. Most of the time we're saying this is a problem. That is something that should be brought directly to the owner from the commissioning provider, and there are tools where that can be addressed. It's challenging. Sometimes the owner's hiring you to check a box, and then that's a real tough time because they don't want to hear the challenges you're bringing to them. They're not helping you resolve them. But generally speaking, there should be tools that you should be working through. It does require being on the ball and juggling at the same time.
So, in an ideal situation, if you've got 3 sets of eyes looking at it, hopefully it'll preclude a lot of problems if it's managed properly.
Agree. But again, the plan should be your friend there. A couple of things we didn't talk about. The owner might tell you what skin they want. Maybe they want all curtain wall. Maybe they want limestone. Maybe they want it to look Georgian. Maybe they want performance above and beyond code. We didn't really talk about performance at all. Maybe they need to maintain operations in particular types of extreme weather or have specific resiliency requirements. Maybe they need to reoccupy portions of their building after particular emergencies. Tolerable maintenance intervals, we talked a lot about that. Ownership duration, I heard that. That's a very important one. In all of these, as you're working through, you have the general discussion, and to the extent possible, it can be hard with something like Georgian architecture. To the extent possible, you want to get this to something that is measurable where possible and clearly defined. We want to know when we have met these requirements. It should not be ambiguous. The owner may tell you things that are very ambiguous. I want to make the cover of architectural magazines, right? That's a real one, has happened. And you need to be ready to start pulling those threads with the owner to figure out what they actually mean, because they're not calling the contractor back in 5 years if they haven't made the cover of the magazines, okay? There's something else that we can get to there. There may be acoustics, special environmental requirements that we've talked about, but making sure that you have your list, you're going through that. ASHRAE has a great, kind of checklist. There's something in the OPR Annex of 2813. NIBS Guideline 3 also has guidelines for these workshops. You're going through those things, you get those questions answered, and you drill down until you have a clear criteria that can be evaluated in the field. And wherever something can be measured, I advise that you establish that measurement and you have some provisions in the field or in laboratory testing as appropriate to actually measure it. And that's generally when we're talking about performance testing. It's going to be measurable, and that is a part of the commissioning standard. Moving away from voluntary standards and guidelines to a code document, the International Green Construction Code has begun to adopt commissioning in general, including enclosure commissioning. We'll go through the major elements of the Green Code and some of the challenges I'm aware of in implementing it. So how many folks have worked on a project that they've commissioned per IgCC? Have not, me neither, actually. I think this is very important to talk about, but I haven't had the opportunity to work on one of these projects before. I've spoken with some folks who have. So we'll go through the major elements. This is just sort of a summary of maybe some good things, some potentially of a bad question mark. Depending on who you are, you may have different feelings about how bad or not bad it is, but some things that you should be aware of as a provider, some things that you want to have on your radar. So good, more systems and services. So there's more scope being commissioned. So potentially good. There's potential for more effect on design and construction decisions because it's codified. So you have to do it. So now maybe people listen to you a little more. Again, if you get, depending on your owner, sometimes people don't want to listen to you. They just want to check the box and get a lead credit and move on. Active involvement after building turnover and recommissioning is included in the standard, which I think is helpful not only to the owner, but to the industry. So going back to the building is so critical for us to understand how the building is actually performing. And then it kind of promises the potential for movement towards some unified expectations of CX professionals. I'm really hedging that language because that has been something that has been ongoing for a very long time, and so I'm hopeful that there'll be some unification, but I've yet to see the industry completely move in one direction, for better or for worse. Some things to be aware of as a provider, some things that you want to be aware of when you're putting your fee together. There's more risk professionally and legally. We'll get into a little bit more later, but this is a little bit more like a special inspections task. So you are being relied upon by the AHJs in a different way than is traditional for enclosure commissioning. Maybe this leads to higher insurance coverages and premiums. I don't think that is the case yet, but that's a concern that's been raised. On paper, there's kind of more stringent requirements for the qualifications. The problem is that in practice, that doesn't play out because we don't have the certifications and certificates. The industry is not there, so it doesn't quite play out the right way.
I know that some insurance companies are looking at actually giving them a break.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, well, that's great, thank you. Potentially there's a competitive advantage for large firms with all specialties in-house, so that's just a consideration to be aware of if you're a provider and if you're putting together these jobs. So this is what I was alluding to before. This is a bit of a different role. The AHJ is going to rely very, very heavily on the commissioning provider. What I've been told from my discussions with AHJs and with folks who provide this service is that ultimately, the AHJs are ill-prepared to begin implementing commissioning. They don't understand it. They don't know very much about the technical depth of enclosures. It's just not an area that they have been trained in. They are also ill-prepared to figure out who is qualified to do it. So they need to rely heavily on us, and they don't know if we're qualified. And to be clear, let's say we even get someone who knows a lot about enclosures and can get a gut feel that I'm qualified. The level of rigor in terms of fairness for the government, for any government entity, is very high. And so if you work for a government entity and you are going to confer, yes, you're qualified, you're not. Those people like to have a list. They don't just like to say, you know what, I've worked with you before and I can tell you're qualified. I have a good, I can tell in my gut. That may be true, but that's generally not how the government likes to operate. That really makes it challenging for them to defend if they need to, and a lot of times they need to, their choices and their fairness. My husband works for the federal government, and he says that there's a saying in his office, which is that, a note to the Inspector General and a FOIA request only cost, I don't even know how much stamps cost anymore, but less than $1. It only costs however much a stamp costs. You just have to drop something in the mail to begin an investigation. So when we think about fairness for the government, we have to just recall that very, very high level that they are held to. And so there is where a lot of this idea of having certifications and certificates is so appealing to government officials, because then they have that to fall back on. The IgCC starts to talk about that, but I think again the industry is not really ready to support that. We have very minimal certifications for enclosure at all. We have minimal certificates for enclosure. There are no certifications. I'm coming to the end of my time. I'm going to do a quick differentiation for those who don't know. Certificate can be the person doing the education can also do the testing. They can be combined. Does not necessitate ISO certification and separation of those two things, and this sort of high rigorous standard of testing separated from education. Certification is a process that requires that the testing company is separate from anyone providing education. There is a level of rigor for firewall between those, and that would hypothetically elevate that process, or certification would be elevated because of that separation. There is, I think I heard a couple people talking about it, this is a certificate program. There's also a certification, which RCI is currently spearheading, kind of all tied in together. It's all in the soup. ASTM is in that as well. Those are two separate but related things.
That's an ongoing process?
Yes.
That process is developed the skill, knowledge, and ability test.
Yes.
And we're now looking for people to help review that.
Oh, great.
So somebody, they can give me their cards, I can get it to Vicki, and she can get that out to have people take a look at it.
And you're looking for people, skilled building enclosure providers? Is that
No, I'm on the committee.
Yeah, I'm aware of, I have some firewall, but I'm aware of the committee. One of the people in my office is on the committee, but the people you're soliciting, you want people who are doing enclosure commissioning provider work.
Anybody who wants to review. What this is the listing of skills, knowledge, and abilities for a certified person.
Yes. And that's the provider, I understand it's provider and technician are the two certifications you guys are looking at right now. And so that, again, I don't get to know that much about it because I'm doing education. But that would be the first certification for enclosure specific commissioning.
Yeah, and you're very correct. It is a separate process, education process based on the ISO 17024. Education is totally separate from the certification.
Yeah, and so you can see how that would be, presuming everything is done to high standards would be a better credential to have. And the committee is working very hard, I know. So thank you. So we're gonna, I'm running a little long. We had some great discussion this. I'm glad we talked about those items. I'm gonna go a little bit quick through this. So this was just a nice little example of, you know, okay, IgCC says you gotta do air testing. Great. I don't think that the AHJ knows the answer to this question. So I think they're hoping that you do. And I think that we would probably come up with quite a few different answers to this question. For those of you not familiar with whole building air testing, the results are reported as a function of your square footage. So whether or not you include the below grade portions is going to significantly affect the denominator of your results. And generally speaking, I'm sure there are specific exclusions to this, but generally speaking, your basement does not leak air. It is very airtight. So that is going to add a huge number to your denominator that's going to potentially artificially lower your results, depending on how you've set this up. What I like to say the answer is that you should have probably defined this way, way, way back during design, before you get to the point where you're doing testing. This is something you should have talked about, but this is just to highlight that this, oh, you guys voted, I'm sorry. I was ready to run through it. Okay, I messed it up. So about 40%, I think, said B, and then we had kind of a mix on the rest of it. And I think a lot of people would say no, but again, the commissioning plan and then the specification should really clearly outline testing criteria, pass-fail criteria, and anything that is not already set forth in the process of the standard that you would like to clarify. Should be very clear, and it should be at the beginning of the project. No one should be surprised about how they're going to be tested. Yes.
But doesn't ASTM 779 require you to calculate your effective leakage area as 6 sides of the box?
Yes. But you get to define the box.
You get to define the box. So what if you have a crawl space?
Right, but I guess in my experience, it's all commercial properties and it's all slab on grade, you know, or podium.
Sure.
Deck, and parking below.
So when it's parking below,
So we do a lot
Yeah.
of stuff in Seattle where it's like 5/2, you know, or
Yeah.
5/4. And so at the podium deck, at the transfer level, a lot of times people will permit the concrete structures type 1 and the parking is type 3 or type 5. But when we go in there, because we have to air barrier test every building in Washington State,
yeah.
bigger than a duplex. And so, you know, there's a lot of people, I guess, I fundamentally kind of disagree with that assertion. Well, I guess if
Well, I'm saying you should just define it. I'm saying you should define it, and that I don't think that everyone in this room would come to the same answer for every single building. Does that, are you okay with that? Or not? My intent is to say that I definitely don't think the AHJ knows. They're relying on us to know. And we need to know. We need to have sufficient technical depth to know the answer. I saw another question. We're running real short on time. Sorry, you can find me afterwards. See, I'm gonna speed up a little bit here. Because AHJs are ill-equipped to deal with this, there is a guideline that is built to provide an overview of the commissioning skill set required to perform the duty. It's a roadmap for the code official to enforce the commissioning process. It is a guideline, but it is called a guideline. It is written in compliance language, and you can adopt it into your code. So I don't know. Code is just ignoring everything I said about guides and standards. But this is something to be on the lookout for if you're talking about IgCC, and this is something that you're working with. Go ahead and see if this is actually adopted, and even if it's not, it may be something to look through to understand how they are, how your code official may be looking at this. In particular, there is an evaluation criteria for CX for each system type, anything that you could want to commission in section 5 of the guideline. So it's kind of a nice area to go ahead and take a look at. Again.
That guideline was just republished.
Okay, yes, it was. And I don't know any of the changes, but I do know that that's a good thing to be aware of if this is in your practice area. And again, you know, this is a letter that was provided, this is a clarification letter that was kind of provided with respect to commissioning guidance and the IgCC and how it's looking at it. And it really highlights the fact that we're still not specifying what is required when accepting an agency to do this work or a provider to do this work. So that's a hot topic. Owners want to understand how to evaluate people. Government agencies want to understand how to evaluate people, and we're not there yet as an industry. We're working on it. I think I'm going to skip agent versus authority, but you guys may be aware there's different terminology in play: agent, authority, provider. There are specific legal reasons to select one versus another. And well, like I said, we're running a bit long. We're going to skip voting too. So again, we kind of delved into this a little bit earlier to talk about LEED and how there is a requirement at a fundamental level. If you're providing a LEED project, you have these 3 tasks that is in fundamental commissioning. But we won't even get into whether or not we feel like that should be called enclosure commissioning or not. LEED does have some really specific requirements about when you should engage this person and who they can work for, which party they can work for. So, they have a lot of language here. Talks about who they can work for, what kind of experience they have. They're more specific than probably anybody on this. Very specific. Okay, so may not be an employee.
They also tell you what percentage of the design it actually needs
Yes.
to have the design review. So keep that in
The-
mind
the-
when you're trying to select someone and what time frame you need to do that in.
Yeah, the time frame and who, like your experience and who you can work for. LEED is very, very, very specific on. I would say they are a little bit less specific on the actual tasks that you should include when you move in to the enclosure commissioning credit, when you're going to do the additional work. So this is the list. Fulfill the fundamental requirements, so do the BOD, OPR, and design review, and then do these things. Review submittals. Does not say how many, and in my experience, it definitely isn't all of them. Verify inclusions of the systems manual and the CDs, fine. Operator training, those are the lists, what you're going to be required to do. Verify systems manual, update and delivery. Operator training effectiveness. Okay, so like half of this is about the systems manual. Verify seasonal testing, again, unless you have an operable facade, this really is my interpretation, and what I have submitted in the past is that this is really about your performance testing for the enclosure. It's not seasonal. Review the building 10 months after substantial completion, the post-occupancy that we've always talked about. Ongoing commissioning plan, which often looks a lot like a recommended maintenance schedule, unless you have specific controls that are coordinated, in which case you may be coordinating with mechanical or electrical for that. And then it says follow ASHRAE Guideline 0 and NIBS Guideline 3. 4.1 is is scheduled to replace the reference to Guideline 3 with a reference to 2947, just because Guideline 3 is no longer being updated, although it will remain available. One thing that I note every time I look at this and gets brought up a lot is that there's very, very minimal construction work here. You don't actually have to go to the job site, it would appear. You don't have to look at anything in progress. You could just do maybe whole building air testing at the end and be okay and submit for a LEED. And I think, from what I've heard from other people, you can, and they will give you the credit. What I would recommend to someone asking about it is that you look to a guide like 28, or a standard like 2813, look at fundamental and use that as your roadmap. If you do fundamental from 2813, you will meet LEED requirements. Absolutely. And I think that roadmap is a little bit more clear in terms of tasks. And then just kind of back check and make sure, well, yeah, I'm going at 10 months for substantial completion. Like I've got that 10 months in there. And those sorts of things. All right, then I rushed and now here we are. So there's challenges and opportunities when we're doing commissioning and we're looking at these documents. In order to be a provider, you have to understand these processes and these documents. That's why they're included in this educational program, even though they are long and sometimes onerous to get through. These are the documents that define the process for us. As an industry, as we talk about these standards and documents, I think that we need to continue to work on and develop consensus standards. We need to work through that process, continuing to update and improve these documents, or create new, enforceable documents as appropriate to fill the gaps. We need to continue to look at our credentialing and certifications. If the marketplace needs a way to identify qualified people. We want that process to be meaningful and good. We don't want it to be a checklist that is meaningless really to an owner. They still can't tell who they should hire. And so as an industry kind of trying to meet those requirements and if you'd like to be part of that, I think give your name to this gentleman. If you'd like to get involved in the ASTM process, please give your name to me. If you would just like to provide me with some feedback and never come to a meeting, I will still bring that to the committee for business. So any questions you ever have in the ASTM or any feedback you'd like to provide, please get it to me and I will make sure that we look at it as a committee. I can't promise quick results, but we look at everything. We want this to be a usable standard that the industry finds meaningful. And just kind of generally, I think whenever you're doing commissioning, think about the holistic approach, right? What we've talked about a lot here, there's these different things defined in the documents, but if you look back to 202, you look at what 2813 is doing, we're talking about beginning to end, pre-design to occupancy and operations, and having that piece for evaluation at each step. And missing any of those in my practical experience can really lose value on the job. If you are never seeing the project in the field, you're missing out on value as an owner, I think. You're missing out on getting something caught early before it's repeated all over your building. Wherever possible, make sure that you're defining quantifiable and really performance that can be evaluated clearly. We shouldn't have an OPR that when we're doing this evaluation, we're not sure if we're meeting it or not. We should have established what that should be. It should be very clear if we're meeting our plan, if we're meeting our OPR. So that concludes the driest of the 3 presentations today. You guys are going to get into, I think, much more interesting and also much more complicated in a lot of ways topics this afternoon or after the break, and get into some technical stuff. But before I go, WAGD developed the source material for all of these workshops, and so we thank him and miss him. And thank you very much.